discussing earlier was that these are things that have happened way back in the 2nd century BC or 4th century BC, and here are people who are painting these heroes, or they are writing plays about them. They are making sculptures, they are printing the books of all these guys who lived about 1500 to 2000 years ago. That is something that Renaissance is about. That is inspiring people, having a continuous intellectual dialogue even after a person has ceased living. Even after Socrates has died, Plato has died, Aristotle has died, all those guys have long been dead, but still the intellectual dialogue goes on. Okay. Around this period, we also see a parallel process. Okay. Then this paper, you know that this paper does not deal with political happenings. That is, a certain king rules and then the next king comes or next dynasty comes. So the thing is, here we will be speaking about processes which are happening parallelly. So please try to uh, stay with me because many a times things get confusing. Because right now I was speaking about somebody like Shakespeare writing in the 16th or 17th century. Then again, why am I going back to Plato's Academy being closed in the so these chronological jumps will always be there, especially in this particular topic, wherein we are speaking about two periods parallelly. One is the classical period, other one is the period of its revival, that is the Renaissance period. Okay, right. Here we can this slide especially deals with a phenomenon which led eventually to the processes that happened during the Renaissance period, and hence the ideology of scholasticism is important. This ideology is essentially in this period, it is rooted in the practices of Christianity. So Christianity and scholasticism are important factors when we are discussing the processes of Renaissance. What are these processes? 6th century, you have Plato's academy being closed. Now, Plato lived in what century? Here?
4th century, man.
Right. 4th century before Christ. And here we are speaking of 529, that is 5 minus and 5 plus, that is almost 1000 years of continued existence of Plato's academy was there. But around the 6th century, one sees this academy getting closed. Why is that? The reason is there is a tussle all the time happening as far as European history is concerned between religious and secular on one hand, and political power and authority of the organized church on the other hand. On one side you have religious versus secular, on another hand you have the political authority versus the religious authority. These two processes are, that is the tussle between these two is always happening all through European history pages. Here one can see that as soon as Plato's academy closes or close on the heels of, or almost simultaneously, one can see a monastery of Saint Benedict's comes up in a place called Mount Cassino. So Plato's academy, what does it signify? It signifies secular learning. So Plato is not somebody who's Christian. Plato lived before Christ. His ideology, philosophy, the asking of higher questions about existence, about your being, all those kinds of things happened continuously in a tradition of philosophical dialogues, discussions, debates for about 1000 years. This obviously was something that was happening in the secular sphere. That is, it had got nothing to do with Christianity or pagan religion or any other religion. They were just people who were debating various ways of understanding the world in a secular manner. Now, in the 6th century, you have somebody called as Saint Benedict. He's a famous saint, and he starts his monastery in Mount Casino. This indicates that education is moving from secular to the religious sphere. Secular to the religious sphere. Now, what is the important difference between secular education and religious education? Can you tell me a specific point?
Like
Yeah.
in American schools, there was this whole debate: should we teach the creationism theory in the school along with theory of evolution? So, like, theory of evolution is secular and scientific and proven with facts, and creationism is a religious Christian myth.
Okay, but people believe it to be true, right?
Yes, they believe it to be true.
Yeah. So the difference between secular and religious, if I say it's a difference of faith, what do you believe in? Religion tells you to have faith in something, and secular tells you to question everything. Would I be correct or wrong?
Yes, ma'am. Correct.
Everybody agrees with that?
Yes.
Secular says ask questions. Religious says have faith. What do you say?
Ma'am, can you repeat what you said?
Yeah, the question was, if I say secular says ask questions and religious says have faith.
Faith. True,
Yeah.
true, absolutely true.
Okay. What about the others? बोला राहुल. धर्मनिरपेक्ष असेल तर आपण प्रश्न विचारू शकतो शिक्षणामध्ये, आणि धार्मिक असेल तर श्रद्धा ठेवावी लागते, विश्वास ठेवावा लागतो, असं मी म्हणलं तर बरोबर आहे का चूक आहे?
हो मॅम, बरोबर आहे. पण मग धर्मनिरपेक्षतेत पण मग काही वेळेस धर्मनिरपेक्षताच धर्म नको बनायला असं पण होऊ शकतं.
हे मात्र खरं आहे, हे मात्र खरं आहे. Rahul points out to a possibility of a fallacy wherein we start having faith in secular ideals, or we start having faith in questioning. Yeah, that is a danger. Yes, I understand and agree with you. Thank you, Rahul. Okay, but by and large, would you say everybody agrees? Utkarsh, you wanted to say something?
Nothing, ma'am.
Okay. By and large, would you say that when education is secular, people are free to ask questions, whereas when education becomes religious, people start, they are expected to have faith instead of asking questions?
Yes, they are not supposed to question the authority of religion.
Yeah. Right. Anybody else wants to say something? Nimisha has been quiet. Zothan has been quiet. Aishani has been quiet.
Ma'am, it's a gray area. It's not a black and white.
Yes.
I think, ma'am, that in religious learning there is kind of a binding, because you have to believe what has been preached. Whereas in secular learning, you can, because you can have you have the right to ask questions, raise questions about something. You kind of branch out a little more, which is kind of a flowing thing.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
like, there will be a little bit of rigidity in like religious learning, a bit of rigidity, but in a secular learning there can be some free or flowless thing, I think.
Yeah.
Also, ma'am, the form of secularism must be different at that time.
What? I didn't hear you.
Ma'am, the form of secularism.
Utkarsh, I
Ma'am, the
didn't
form
get
of
you.
secularism could be different at that time.
Form of secularism would be different. Yes, now I mean, the kind of secularism that we preach and practice in the 21st
Yes.
century is definitely different than what it was expected to be in that period. Yes, very true. Okay. Anything else? Anybody wants to say something else? Okay. So, right. So what happens here is education starts moving from secular to the religious field, wherein, as somebody pointed out, one has to trust the authorities and one has to, I mean, the freedom that one has is only about interpretation. That in itself is quite a bit of freedom, but still not 100%. So you have the basic focus of learning is about how to interpret a particular text that is being preached by or written by a particular authority. Question becomes about interpretation. Scholasticism is a way of trying to interpret the sentences. And we need not be dismissive about this idea because it does not encourage too much of original thinking. The kind of teaching learning atmosphere that we practice today is by and large rooted in the traditions of scholasticism. This rise of universities, the idea of creation of knowledge together, the idea of imparting of education, idea of grading of education. All these things are definitely a heritage from this tradition of scholasticism. So we kind of should be thankful also about the ideology or the practices of scholasticism. Here one can see details about how religious scriptures came to be interpreted through various methodologies. Okay, now who's Saint Benedict? And here is a amusing picture of Benedict being approached by King Totila. I don't know how to pronounce that. So this person in white robes is who's he and who's this? Who is the king and who is the priest?
The one bending his knee is the king. Ma'am, the one
What?
bending his knee is the king.
Yeah, the one who's kneeling on his
Yeah.
knees
Is the king.
the one in white, the Saint Benedict. Now see this fellow, Saint Benedict, lived in the 5th and the 6th century, and he's being painted by somebody in the what century? When is he getting painted?
14th century.
14th century, right? Again, this time gap of about 1,000 years. Okay, the story here is amusing, but maybe you can Google it. This Benedict was quite a famous person, not saint at that time, but a famous religious figure. And this king, Attila, he felt that, okay, I can deceive him by sending somebody else who's an imposter. And he sent somebody else dressed as if he was the king, and along with the whole paraphernalia. But Benedict, it seems, realized that this was not the real king. So he sent back the imposter, and then King Attila felt that, okay, I've been caught kind of red-handed in deceiving the saint. So he comes to Saint Benedict and says, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And Benedict gives him a good piece of his mind. That is the story being narrated here. Okay. But story is, yes, it is important for us because it speaks about the kind of tussle that we had earlier spoken religious authority. But for us here, it's important because mainly because of the time gap of 1,000 years when he's getting painted. Okay. किती बोलले मी हे इंग्लिश अनुश्री किती मिनिटाचं झालं आहे आता
नो आयडिया मॅम ते दाखवत नाही टायमिंग
डिड आय स्पीक फॉर अ लॉंग टाइम
आय थिंक
Okay.
सो मॅम
Okay, I'll just cover this and then stop with the English thing. Okay, this is also period. Earlier we spoke about the tradition of scholasticism, wherein interpretation of text is something is a art and science that gets refined during this period. We also saw this process of the tussle between the king and the religious authority, and the other process of rejuvenation, revival of things that happened thousands of years ago. And we'll move on to those two were by and large political and academic processes. Here we have an academic process of a different kind, wherein you see Albertus Magnus or Magnus is somebody who's lived in the century, and he is somebody who's offering a Latin interpretation of Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC, with the help of Avicenna or Ibn Sina, who lived in the what century? Ibn Sina has lived in what century? Avicenna?
10th century.
10th and the 11th century. 10th, 11th century. Okay. This picture here on the left side is, what is it about? Those of you who have been working for too long on computers, they will know what a backache is like. Backache. And posture correction. The moment you go to your ortho, whatever doctor, he says your posture needs to be corrected. He doesn't say you need a surgery or you need medicine. He says you should be sitting in a proper position. Avicenna here is seen giving a treatment for posture correction. Treatment for posture correction. Now, you'll say, okay, you spoke about religion, you spoke about interpretation, and now why have you suddenly gone on to medicine? I've gone on to medicine because this is also a very, very important field of knowledge which sees revival during the Renaissance period, medicine. And doesn't come directly from the Greco-Roman tradition to the 15th century Renaissance physicians and medical practitioners. It comes through the medium of Arab scientists such as Ibn Sina. So this Ibn Sina or Avicenna, the Romanized name is Avicenna, is a person, a physician. He is also many other things, but a Renaissance man truly. He is somebody who has lived in what area? Where does he come from? Avicenna? Homeland? Avicenna's homeland? Iran. Iran. His book, The Canon of Medicine, is something that went on to be referred to. Even today it is referred, but it was like a materia medica thing for physicians, doctors all across the Western world till about the 18th and the 19th century. He is somebody who wrote about medical conditions and their remedies, and his techniques, his many remedies were based on whose knowledge? Hippocrates. Hippocrates. Who's Hippocrates? if you have a brother or a sister who is a doctor, you will know who is Hippocrates. Even otherwise, you should know. What do the doctors do as soon as they become?
Hippocratic oath.
Right. So they have to take an oath, which is named after this person called as Hippocrates or Hippocrates. He was a great, obviously, Greek physician. And based on this knowledge created by Hippocrates during the Greco-Roman period, during the Greek period, really speaking, Avicenna, writing in the 15th, 16th century, writes his own book, which is used by the Renaissance people here. This picture, you'll say, how come this Avicenna is writing in the 16th century and Albertus Magnus is writing in the 13th century? How can he base his ideas on Avicenna? What is the answer to that? This is an edition 16th century. Avicenna is somebody who lived in the what century? See here. Ibn Sina, which period?
10th and 11th century.
Yeah. So he lived in the 10th and the 11th century. Illustrations from his book. But the edition is from 1556. He lived in the 11th century, but the book got printed in the 16th century. One of the many editions was in continued existence. Okay. These are various, the pictures, they look funny to us today, but it's important for us to know that Avicenna is somebody writing in the 10th and the 11th century, and he knows that these systems are different. One is a visceral system, other is the nervous system, nerves. And he provided illustrations. These are not illustrations by him, but he speaks about these different systems coexisting in the body. He is also somebody who's written about mountains, amusing stuff. What I'm trying to highlight here is that, and here the last sentence is important, the rich cultural enlightenment of the Islamic world awakened a benighted Europe, sleeping Europe, from its intellectual sleep. Avicenna was perhaps the movement's greatest ambassador. This is what the Encyclopedia Britannica says. And he is not alone, there are others. Ibn Zur is there, Abu al-Qasim is there, many others, Ibn Rushd is there. So, point that I'm trying to make here is that the Arab intellectuals in various fields were very, very important in bringing about the Renaissance in the European continent. So, you cannot imagine Renaissance without the contributions of the Arab intellectuals. Please don't be under the impression that these guys simply started studying, that is all these Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo and all those people. They simply started looking up the books from Greco-Roman period and they got sudden, bursts of imagination and inspiration and they became great. It's not like that. These texts by the Greco-Roman scholars had all kind of disappeared, lost, many were destroyed, but for the translations offered by the Arab intellectuals. Europe, earlier on we saw the map of the Roman Empire. Remember that? Here? Okay. Now you will see what is the importance of this whole area, which is on the right side, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. Whatever was happening here was culturally connected with the entire Roman Empire, and even if this part, the left part, even if the Western Roman Empire dissipates, what happens is the Eastern Roman Empire survives. And what is the capital of that Eastern Empire?
Constantinople.
Capital of the Eastern. Yes. Constantinople, Istanbul, today's Turkey, which is adjacent to the Arabian Peninsula. So all these fellows writing here in Italy, in the Western Roman Empire, Plato, Aristotle, I mean, some were Greek also, but essentially part of the Greco-Roman tradition. Socrates, all these people, their writings had been preserved here in what was then called as, what was the old name? What is the Roman name of Constantinople? What empire was this called? Eastern Roman Empire was called as the
Byzantine.
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 By Ottoman later on, because the Usmanlis started ruling it. But while it was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, this place, same as Constantinople and Istanbul, was called as Byzantium. So the learning from Greco-Roman traditions was preserved in the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, that is the Byzantine Empire. Clear so far? Clear so far?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, I'll stop here for the English mediums and